Charm packs are such a fun way to start a new project. I love getting every single print from one fabric line, and it's so easy to jump right in and start sewing. Charm packs are pre-cut 5-inch squares that typically come in a pack of 42. Sometimes the backs will even show you what prints are inside. I love charm packs because they always have them for new collections, and they're just super quick to grab and really fun to use. Since we're starting with perfect pre-cuts, we've already eliminated a lot of opportunity for a mistake. Today I'm going to show you 4 projects that start with a charm pack. So grab a charm pack and let's get started. The first project is this bubble quilt. This is a puffy quilt that is so fun to make.
The blocks in this quilt are stuffed, making it dimensional and really neat.
So gather your supplies and let's jump right in.
You're going to need fabric scraps, a ruler, a rotary cutter and a mat, pins, stuffing, and backing materials, including a backing, batting, binding, and thread. My favorite ruler for this is the Cute Cuts ruler that's green, has seam allowance on the edge, and one starting in the same corner. Use your ruler to cut out puff squares measuring 5 inches wide. Then we're going to cut out base squares measuring 4.5 inches wide. Cut 90 of each square size for the baby size and 208 for the throw size. Head to my website to print these free planning pages. They include measurements, number of squares, and a coloring page. The coloring page includes 2 sizes and will allow you to design your quilt before you start. We're going to start by assembling the puff squares one at a time. Grab a base square and a puff square and line them up at each of the corners. Pin the corners, pinching the fabric as you go to make sure they fit correctly. Since the base square is smaller than the puff square, there will be some excess fabric that will billow up, and that's what's going to be used to make our dimensional puff. Once you have all the corners pinned, we're going to use that excess fabric to create pleats. On each side, pinch that excess fabric and pin it down. You can see the little pleat on the edge. Now we're going to repeat with all the remaining edges. Make sure you're pinning the pleats all in the same direction. We only need to pin 3 pleats down, leave one edge open. Now we're going to sew those 3 pleated edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Backstitch at the beginning and end of your stitching and pivot at the corners. When you're done, you'll have a square sewn with one edge open. Continue sewing squares until you have enough for your quilt. Now we're going to sew the blocks into rows. Line the squares up with the open edges on the same side. Pin the squares together on the side edge with the right sides together. Sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, backstitching at each end. After you've sewn that seam, you'll have your first 2 squares sewn together. Remember to check that the open edges are on the same side. Continue adding squares to your row until you have enough for your quilt size. Each row in the baby size needs 9 blocks, and each row in the throw size needs 13 blocks. For the baby size, you'll need 10 rows. For the throw size, you'll need 16. Keep sewing your rows until you have enough for your quilt size. Now we're going to start stuffing the quilt. Grab the first row and a light handful of stuffing and put it inside one of your puff blocks. You can decide how much you want to stuff your blocks. Once you have stuffed them to your liking, we're going to pin each block closed. Create the last pleat on your final side of your puff block. Pin it in place and repeat with the rest of the blocks in your row. When you're done, we're going to head to the sewing machine and sew that whole row closed. Use your hand to keep the stuffing out of the way as you sew down with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now with your first row stuffed, we're going to grab another row and make sure we like the placement of the fabrics. If you don't, grab a different one, and we're going to pin these together. With the open side facing you, we're going to flip the second row up on top of the first row and match all the seam allowances between each block. Pin each intersection, pushing one seam allowance to the left and one to the right. This is called interlocking or nesting your seam allowances and will reduce bulk. Once you've pinned, go ahead and sew those 2 rows together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The second row is still unstuffed. Now stuff the second row just like you did the first and pin those pleats. Continue stuffing and sewing rows together until you have used up all your rows. Now we're going to tie our quilt together. Grab some embroidery floss or yarn that matches the back of your quilt and basting spray. You'll also need some little scissors for this step. Lay the backing of your fabric face down on your floor and then do a layer of batting and finally your puff quilt right side up. Peel back your layers and spray baste these layers together. The spray baste is a temporary adhesive that will keep everything together while you tie your quilt together. Once your spray base has dried, you'll see that the layers have stuck together. At this point, if you want to move your quilt so you can quilt it somewhere else, roll it up to keep it all together. We're going to do a classic tie quilt method. Thread your needle and find an intersection at the edge of your quilt. Working from behind, push your needle up through one of the quilt squares at the corner of the intersection. Push it back through the square kitty corner from your first square. You'll create a diagonal stitch and then tie it on the back of the quilt with a triple knot to finish off this tie. Trim the thread so you still have about 1/2 inch left. You don't want it to be too short because the thread might come undone. Repeat until you've done all the intersections. Now we're going to finish by tacking the edges down. So first we're going to straighten out the pleated edge of each puff square and pin it in place. Then you're going to baste around the entire quilt. Once you've basted, trim off the rest of the batting and backing fabric. The last step is to finish the edges with binding. Sew your binding to the front of the puff quilt, then flip it to the back and sew it on by hand. If you've never done binding before, click the link in the description to learn how. Once you're finished, your quilt is done.
Next, I'm going to show you how to make this charm square pillow. Although this project has tiny squares, we're going to use a simple strip method to piece it together.
You'll need one charm pack for this project. I'm using this one called Autumn by Lori Holt. It has 42 squares and I love how it shows all of them on the back. You also need 5/8 yard of the lining fabric that will also be the backing for our pillow. And craft interfacing, this is an extra firm. 5/8 yard quilt batting, a rotary cutter, spray based, and other sewing supplies like pins and an iron.
Start by opening up your charm pack. I love opening these up. It's so satisfying to find all these different fabrics. Now we're going to pull out 9 different prints from this pack. We'll be sewing these together in groupings of 9, so I'm just trying to get a variation of colors for my first strip. The first step is to cut each of these squares in half. So we're going to use an acrylic ruler and a rotary cutter. And since these are 5-inch squares, we're going to cut them in half at 2.5 inches. After you're finished cutting all of those in half, grab one of each color from your stack. Set one of your stacks aside for later and then line these halves up in an order that you like. Now we're going to sew these together along the long edge of the rectangles with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just keep adding to your strip until you've sewn all of these rectangles together. When your strip is done, we're going to bring it to our ironing board and press all the seams in one direction. This will help us keep the fabric flat while we cut it in half. Now bring your fabric over to your cutting mat. We're going to cut this exactly in half, so a measure again at 2.5 inches. A long acrylic ruler will help you do this all in one go. And now you have 2 strips. Repeat the whole process until you have 10 strips. Now we're going to mix up our strips. We actually only need 9 of these strips, so you can get rid of one of them. I've put them in piles with their identical strip matching. So what I did is I put them in order from 1 to 5, and then took strip number 4, turned it over and put it next to 5, and repeated that until I got all the way back down to 1. You can do this however you want though. The next step is to turn over all of these strips. I like to keep them in order just by carefully turning them over in place. So we need to press the seam allowances in opposite directions. That way we can lock our seams and get a crisper finish. So pick up each strip individually and press down, up, down, up, down, up, and so on. Now grab your first 2 strips, matching them at that seam where they meet. And we're going to push those seam allowances together. Because of the way we have pressed our seam allowances, they'll match right up and they will butt up against each other. This is also referred to as interlocking seams. This way those intersections will be really crisp. So send those through your machine with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You don't necessarily have to pin if you don't want to. You can just make sure to lock each seam before you go over it with your needle. So I'm sewing this slowly, and every time I get to one of those intersections, I'm just making sure that the seam allowances are going in the direction I want and that they're butted up against each other. When your 2 strips are sewn together, you can bring it up and see how interlocking those seams makes those intersections really nice. So then go ahead and put this right back where it was and then grab the next one. I like to put it back down, face down, to keep it in order. Continue this process until you have sewn the entire pillow top together. Now grab a piece of interfacing bigger than your pillow top, and with a sticky side facing the back of the pillow cover, we're going to press these together really well to fuse that interfacing onto the back. This interfacing will add so much crispness to your pillow, you'll be glad you did it. Once that is done, just trim around the edges to get rid of any excess interfacing. The next step is to back this with a layer of needle felted quilt batting. You can measure this out if you want, but I prefer just to put my pillow top on the batting and cut around, leaving just a little bit extra on the sides. We're going to do the same thing with the lining fabric that will act as our backing as we quilt this pillow top. Now we're going to use spray base to keep these layers together. This is a sprayable adhesive that's really easy to use. So just lift up your first layer, spray it on the batting, and press firmly down, keeping all the fabric straight and lined up. Now repeat the same process with the backing or lining fabric, spraying on that fabric to adhere the batting to it. Once those layers are stuck together, we're going to let it dry. Once it has had time to dry, bring it to your sewing machine, and we are going to quilt on the top of this. So you can choose any pattern you want to to quilt those layers together, what I like to do is sew 1/4 inch on either side of every seam. So it is a lot of lines, but it looks really good when you're done. So then bring it back and go down that seam on the other side 1/4 inch from the middle of the seam. Once all your vertical lines are done, turn the pillow top and do the horizontal lines the same way. When your quilting is finished, trim this down to 18 by 18 inches. When you're quilting, the fabric will sometimes shrink in at parts, so you might end up with a little bit of batting on the sides. That's okay though, because we are going to use a larger seam allowance around those edges and that batting will be hidden. So just make sure your pillow top is all squared up. Now we're ready to work on the back. Cut 2 layers of batting 18 by 10.5 and 2 lining pieces 18 by 21 inches. We're going to start by folding the back piece in half, matching those short 18-inch edges and folding it to create a crease in the middle. Then open that up and line up your batting with the crease and the edge of the fabric. Fold the other edge of the fabric over the top to make a sandwich. Pin all the edges together along the fold and then sew that in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side of the back. Now we're going to assemble the pillow cover. So grab your main pillow top, put it face up, and then put one of the backs on one side and one on the other. These are going to overlap a few inches in the middle, but make sure you line up the corners. Pin all the outside edges of the pillow together and then sew around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You don't need to leave an opening since we can use the middle to turn. I recommend backstitching along the overlap because that is kind of a vulnerable part when we're opening our pillowcase. Now trim those corners and clip the seam allowance a little bit to reduce bulk. Now turn your pillowcase right side out. Make sure to poke those corners out using a chopstick or another tool, and then we're going to bring this to our ironing board and press it really well. The last step is to grab an 18 by 18 inch pillow form and stuff it inside your pillow cover. And now it's ready to be used. Next, I'm going to show you this half square triangle zipper pouch that starts with charm squares. Half square triangles are super fast when you're starting with pre-cuts. We're going to quilt the top of this pouch to make it extra fun. This pouch is lined and you can finish the seam allowance with bias tape if you want. Let's collect our supplies. You're going to need 1 charm pack. We're not going to use all of it. We need about 20 squares. I'm using this one called Marigold, and I actually, instead of picking from all the colors, I sort of went with a color palette of purples, whites, yellows, and pinks. So you'll see I have a lot of blues or oranges left, and I'll use these for another project. Basting spray, a rotary cutter, fabric marker, a zipper at least 12 inches. I like to just use a longer one. I just have this really long one on hand, but as long as it's at least 12 inches, we can cut it down. Bias tape, this will be 3/8 inch double fold if you want to finish that inside seam allowance. Lightweight fusible interfacing, quilt batting. This will give it a nice quilty look. An acrylic ruler and mat, and a 1/4 yard of cotton fabric for the lining. So now that you have all your supplies, we're going to start by sewing the half square triangles. I'm going to show you a super easy method, so let's get going. We're going to use the 4 at a time method. So pick 2 charm squares and place them together with right sides together. Then we're going to sew all the way around the edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Use your fabric marker to draw lines corner to corner diagonally, and then use your rotary cutter to cut along those lines. Pull apart your sections and then open them to reveal your half square triangles. You'll have 4 for each time you do this process. Press the half square triangles open with the seam allowance pressed towards the darker fabric. Now we're going to trim these down to 3 inches square. I like to use this Cutie Cuts. This is a 3.5 inch ruler, so I'm going to use those 2 points at 3 inches and the corner point to help me Make sure the top corner and the 3-inch mark are lined up right in between both fabrics, and then trim along the edges. Turn the square around and repeat on the other 2 edges so you have a perfect square. Repeat this process until you have 20 half square triangles for each front and back, so you'll need a total of 40 half square triangles. Now we'll sew the half square triangles together in rows. Grab your first 20 squares and arrange them in 4 rows of 5 squares. You can arrange these however you want. I chose to do a diagonal pattern. Once you have your pattern designed, we're going to start sewing these together in rows. So take your first 2 squares and sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. To keep my rows in the right order, I like to put my squares back and then take the next square to add to the row. Repeat until you've sewn all 4 rows together. To get a really nice finish on the top of our pouch, we're going to turn these rows over and press the seam allowances in opposite directions. So the first row will press towards the left, and the second row towards the right, the third to the left, and the fourth to the right. Flip the rows back over so the right sides are showing, and take the top 2 rows together. We're going to sew along the top edge. Press the seam allowances together so that you feel them butting up against each other, and then place a pin to hold it. This is called interlocking seams, and it is going to help us get those crisp squares that we want with the points where they should be. Once you have that ready, sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and flip it open to reveal your gorgeous squares. Repeat with the other 2 rows. Now we're going to press those seam allowances in one direction. It doesn't matter which direction, but just make sure it's the same direction. Be gentle around your existing seam allowances because we don't want to change the way that those are pressed. Now fuse a piece of fusible interfacing to the back of this panel. I like to use lightweight fusible interfacing. This will just make your bag a little bit extra crisp and pretty. Trim the excess interfacing. Now we're going to make a stack with a piece of lining fabric that's bigger than our pattern piece, and then a layer of batting, and then our pieced panel on top. We're going to use spray base to hold these layers together while we quilt them. Let the spray base set for a few minutes, and then we'll take this to our machine. You can do any kind of top stitching. I chose to follow the diagonal lines of the half square triangles on the left of each of those intersections. After you've finished quilting your panel, grab your pattern piece. We're going to cut out 2 layers of the main pouch. These will be our front and back for our zipper pouch. Now we're going to assemble our pouch. Place the zipper face down on the front piece, lining up the zipper tape with the top edge of the quilted piece. Sew the zipper to the pouch close to the edge of the zipper teeth. You don't need to use a zipper foot for this, just align your needle closest to the zipper teeth. After you've sewn that, press the seam allowance down toward the zipper pouch. And then sew along the top edge 1/8 inch from the fabric. Now grab the back piece. We're going to put this on the zipper tape at the same place we did the front. So line that up and then pin in place. Sew that on and then repeat the top stitching process. If you have extra zipper tape on the tail end of your zipper, trim that off. Open up your zipper part way and then fold your fabric on top of each other so the right sides are together. Now pin the 2 sides together, making sure to line up the corners and the top edges. When you get to the zipper tape, we're going to fold the zipper tape inward and pin it there. Repeat on the other side too. Push the zipper tape down towards the bag. Now sew around the bag with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Trim it down to 1/4 inch and clip around the curved corners. Finishing the inside seam allowance is an optional step, but to make it look pretty, we're going to use bias tape. So the first step is to open your double fold bias tape and find the first crease near the raw edge. Sew right in that crease to attach the bias tape. Now we're going to fold this over to sandwich our seam allowance inside, but first fold along the top to finish that top edge. Stretch it over, and I like to use sewing clips for this step. Sewing clips will hold the bias tape in place, and they're easy to take out when you get to the presser foot. Now just top stitch on that bias tape to hold it all in place. The top edges where the zipper are can be really tricky, so use your hand wheel on your sewing machine if you need to, and don't worry too much because you won't see those corners when we turn this right side out. Now turn your pouch right side out by pushing that lining into the zipper pouch. and then give it a final press. And finally, I'm going to show you how to make this Halloween bucket. You can also use this for Easter or even home decor. These buckets are big enough for all the candy you could want and even stand up on their own. The patchwork is super fun and easy to make with 5-inch charm squares. You only need 1 charm square pack to make this bucket, but you can mix and match if you want or throw in some scraps. The patchwork is easy to sew with this quick method, and you only need a few other supplies, so let's get started. I'm using this line called Hey Boo, which is really cute. It has some fun prints and fun colors like pinks, purples, whites, and oranges, and some super cute prints like ghosts and spider webs. Another cute line if you want a more classic black and orange Halloween is called Sophisticated Halloween, and I'll link to both of these in my description. You're also going to need some double fold bias tape. Just pick a color that matches your line. A ½ yard of contrast, this will be the lining and the handle. Fusible interfacing, and then also fusible fleece. We'll need a rotary cutter, and a long ruler is helpful for this project, and a fabric marker. Download the pattern from my website. This is a free download. Just click the link in the description. It'll print out on 2 pages, and then you can tape them together. This has the pattern piece for the base and the handle. We'll make the body of the bag using the charm squares. Now open up your charm pack, and we're going to pick out 28 squares to use in the bucket. Sew 2 squares together, and then continue sewing squares together until you have a strip with 7 squares. Press the seam allowances flat all in one direction. Sew a total of 3 rows, each with 7 charm squares. Now grab your acrylic ruler, and we are going to cut these strips in half. Since we started with 5-inch squares, we're going to cut them a width of 2½ inches wide. Now we're going to lay the strips out in a half brick pattern. You can decide where to put each strip, and you can even flip them for more variety. To make the half brick pattern, we'll pay attention to where the seams are. We're going to line up the seam of one strip in the middle of one of the other blocks. Pin in place to keep your seam allowances going the direction you want, and then sew together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After you've sewn that, flip it open and pin the 3rd row to the panel. Repeat until you've sewn all 6 rows together. Now flip your panel over and press all the seam allowances down. Now we're going to use our rotary cutter and ruler to cut off the extra half bricks on each edge. Trim off the fabric so that it is squared up, and then repeat on the other side. Your panel should be about 12½ inches by 29 inches. If it is a little shorter than 12½ inches, that's okay. Now we're going to back the panel with fusible fleece. This will give the bucket stability so that it can stand up on its own. Lay the fusible fleece with the adhesive side up. This will be the scratchy side. And then put the patchwork panel down on top of it, facing up. Use an iron to press well to fuse the fleece to the panel. Trim off the excess fleece. Now we're going to top stitch the panel with a quilting pattern. I like to do straight lines across the panel about 1/4 inch from the horizontal strip seams. So I'll do 1 on each side of each seam, but you can really do any pattern here. Those quilting lines just give it that extra quilty look. The last step for the panel is to sew a line of stay stitching across the bottom. This is just regular length stitching, sewn at 3/8 inch across the bottom. This will help us piece our base to the panel. Now we're going to use the pattern piece to cut out 2 base pieces. Make sure the fold line on the base pattern piece is on a fold. You can either cut a rectangle 12.5 inches by 29 inches or use your quilted panel as a pattern piece to cut out this piece. Now we're going to turn the panels into a cylinder to create the bucket. So line up the short edges of your panel and sew across with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then repeat with the lining. Fuse fleece interfacing to the back of one of your base pieces. Then stay stitch around the base pieces 3/8 inch from the edges. Before we sew the base to the main panel, we're going to use our fabric marker to mark quarter points on our cylinder and our base piece. This will help us match them up evenly. Fold your cylinder in half and mark the halfway point, use the seam as the other side. Then match up that seam with the pin, and then fold in half and mark those quarter points. To mark the quarter points on the base piece, fold in half so you have a half circle and mark in those folds on both sides. Then match up those points and mark the other quadrants. To assemble, we'll start by pinning those quarter marks to help us evenly space the base piece. Once you have the quarters pinned, come in and pin more in between those quadrants. The stay stitching will help you get the fabrics evenly pinned. Then sew around the base 3/8 inch from the edge. Clip the seam allowance with the end of your scissors. Repeat the process with your lining fabrics. To assemble the bucket, turn your main piece right side out with the lining inside out, and then place the lining inside the main bucket. Pin the layers together and then baste around the top to hold them together. Open up your bias tape and we're going to sandwich this over the top edge of the bucket and then hold it in place with clips. When you get back to where you started, press under about 1/4 inch of the bias tape and overlap it. Then top stitch all the way around the bucket to hold the bias tape in place. Cut a handle piece using your pattern piece, or just cut a strip of fabric 5 inches by 21 inches, back with lightweight fusible interfacing. Press in half and then press the long edges into the middle to meet. Now press over again to match the folded edges. And then top stitch on both sides of the handle about 1/8 inch from the edges. Press under about 1/4 inch on both of the short edges. Lay your bucket out on the table and find halfway points by folding it in half. Mark the points with pins. This is where we will sew the handles. Pin the handle inside of the bucket about 1.25 inches below the rim. Now sew over the end of the handle, sew a square and then sew an X through it. Go over this at least 2 times to give the handle a good hold, and then repeat on the other side. I hope you enjoyed sewing with me today. For more projects, click the video above.